Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this video is an audiobook-style story created in partnership with Fabularis. If you enjoy complete, emotional and immersive stories like this one, you can listen to many more on fabularis.com. The link is on description. Now get comfortable, settle in and immerse yourself in this story until the very end. There is a ledger entry from 1843 that survives in fragmentary form in the private archive of what was once the Milledgeville Recorder, a small weekly newspaper that ceased publication sometime in the early 1850s. The entry is brief. It occupies less than 2 lines. It records the transfer of a woman listed as Ruth Ann Bell, age 34, condition described as infirm, for the sum of 2 coins. 2. The transaction is dated to a Tuesday morning in late March. No ceremony, no formal witnesses beyond a small gathering of men whose names appear separately in other documents from the same period. For decades, that entry meant nothing to anyone. It was one record among thousands generated by a system that reduced human lives to column entries, transferable figures, depreciating assets. But in the winter of 1941, a researcher named Claire Whitmore, then affiliated with a small historical society based in Macon, came across a photostatic copy of that ledger page while going through a collection of materials donated by the estate of a retired county clerk. She almost passed it over. What stopped her was not the amount. She had seen stranger figures in similar records, but a marginal notation, written in a different hand, in faded pencil, beside Ruth Ann Bell's name. The notation read, "Removed before questions." Claire Whitmore's grandfather had been a circuit judge in Baldwin County during the 1850s. His name appeared in several of the documents surrounding that period. She did not make that connection immediately, but she began pulling threads. What follows is a reconstruction of the events of 1843, drawn from surviving fragments of the Milledgeville Recorder, private correspondence recovered from the Whitmore family collection, medical ledgers held at the time by a physician named Silas Merrow, land and property transfer records from the Baldwin County Courthouse, and oral accounts gathered by a Methodist minister in 1861 from elderly residents of the county who had agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. Those oral testimonies were transcribed, bound in a single notebook, and donated to a seminary library in Atlanta, where they remained uncatalogued until 1948. The notebook itself disappeared during a building renovation in 1962. What remains are Claire Whitmore's own transcriptions of passages she had copied by hand before the renovation. Some of this record is incomplete. Some of it contradicts itself. That is, in many ways, the point. Milledgeville in the 1840s was a city that understood itself as orderly. It was the state capital of Georgia at the time, a distinction it had held since 1804, and its residents took some pride in the presence of government buildings, a state penitentiary, and the Central State Hospital, then known as the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, which had opened on the western edge of the city in 1842. The city sat between the Oconee River to the west and a series of low, pine-covered ridges to the east. The streets near the capital were wide and unpaved, softening into mud after rain. The surrounding countryside was divided into large plantations and smaller farms connected by dirt roads that became unreliable in wet weather. The Vale property lay approximately 9 miles south of the city center, accessible by a road that ran parallel to a creek called Fishing Creek before cutting east through stands of longleaf pine. Thomas Vale had inherited the property from his father in 1831. By the early 1840s, the property was encumbered by debt, a fact that appears indirectly in several county court filings from the period. Though no formal insolvency proceeding was ever opened, Vale continued to be received socially in Milledgeville. He attended the same church as several county officials. His name appears on subscription lists for civic improvements. His financial difficulty, whatever its precise dimensions, was not publicly acknowledged. Ruth Ann Bell had been in the Vale household since at least 1835, when she appears in a property inventory as part of the domestic staff assigned to the main house. The inventory lists her age as approximately 26, her assigned duties as laundering, correspondence preparation, and assistance with household management. That last phrase, correspondence preparation, is unusual. Most inventories from the period list domestic duties in narrower terms. It is not clear who wrote the inventory or whether the phrase was intended to mean anything specific, but it appears there, in ink, in a document that survived in the Baldwin County Courthouse records until at least 1953, when it was cited in Claire Whitmore's research notes. What those research notes suggest, and Whitmore is careful throughout to describe her conclusions as suggestions, not findings, is that Ruth Ann Bell's position in the Vale household had given her prolonged and repeated access to documents, correspondence, and conversations that most people in her position would not have been expected to process or retain. Whitmore does not claim that Ruth could read in the conventional sense. The evidence does not support that claim, and she does not make it. What she does suggest, based on the fragments available, is that Ruth had developed an acute capacity for pattern recognition, for remembering sequences of names, dates, numerical figures, and the physical characteristics of seals and signatures in ways that may have been invisible to the people around her. She had spent years in a house where information moved constantly and where the assumption that she was not attending to it may have made her more attentive, not less. In the winter of 1842, according to a passage in one of the letters from the Whitmore collection, a letter from an unnamed woman to a cousin in Augusta, written in a hand that Whitmore identified as belonging to a neighbor of the Vale property, Ruth began to lose weight visibly. She was seen at the edge of the property on several occasions, which was noted as unusual for someone whose duties were domestic. By February of 1843, Thomas Vale had described her in at least 2 conversations, both reported second-hand, as a liability. The exact word used in one account is spent. In another, someone recalls Vale saying she had become more trouble than weight. The phrasing, Whitmore notes, is strange. She was sick. That was the public explanation. The word trouble applied to a sick person is a different category of description. The sale took place on a Tuesday morning. The location was a property adjacent to a commercial building on the south side of the main road, running through the lower part of Milledgeville, not at the courthouse steps, where formal auctions were typically held, but at a secondary location used for smaller, less formal transactions. The gathering was small. Whitmore's research identifies, with varying degrees of certainty, approximately 6 individuals who were present. Among them, Thomas Vale himself, a man identified in one account as a representative of a creditor, 2 farmers from adjacent properties, Silas Merrow, the physician whose name would reappear throughout the subsequent investigation, and a man named Abel Carter. Abel Carter was 31 years old at the time. He had operated a small printing press in Milledgeville since approximately 1839, producing commercial announcements, legal notices, and a modest weekly sheet that functioned irregularly as a local newspaper. He was described in the tax records of the period as a tradesman. He is mentioned in 2 surviving social columns from other Georgia papers, both times in unflattering terms, once as a printer of low standing, and once as a man whose relations with respectable society remained at professional distance. He had no significant property. He was not a member of any church congregation that left a record. What Carter was doing at that particular transaction is not entirely clear. One of the oral testimonies gathered by the Methodist minister in 1861 from a man who described himself as having been nearby that morning on an errand suggests Carter had been told about the sale in advance and arrived with the specific intention of being present. The account does not explain how Carter knew about it or why he considered it important to attend. He offered 2 coins. No one else offered anything. The accounts differ on whether there was silence before his offer or whether other men had already declined to bid. What the accounts agree on is that the transaction concluded quickly, with minimal formality, and that at least one of the men present left the area immediately afterward without speaking to the others. Whitmore identifies that man with some uncertainty as Silas Merrow.